From the high desert of northern New Mexico, this is Circle for Original Thinking. I am your host, Glenn Aparicio Perry. Welcome to Circle for Original Thinking, America's electronic talking circle for visionary thinkers. An open forum for fresh ideas and timeless wisdom applied to today's political and ecological challenges. Each week, we bring together creative thinkers from a variety of different traditions. We ask the hard questions on the important issues of the day: political polarization, climate change, virulent viruses, and other symptoms of humanity being out of balance with the natural world. Our goal is to recreate a whole and sacred America, a new and improved version of E Pluribus Unum, from the many to the one, and this time not leave anybody out. Join us as we embark on this quest. We've been speaking with Jeremy Johnson and Barbara Carlson on the coronavirus and the radical interconnection of the human to the microbial world, the evolution of consciousness and structures of consciousness. Now we continue to part two of our interview.
You know, one of my favorite poets is Gary Snyder, and he wrote about a poem. I don't remember the title of it, but it's about making your mind like compost. And he said the new stuff goes on top. Turn it over, wait and water down from the dark bottom. Turn it inside out. Let it spread through. Watch it sprout. A mind like compost. So my question for both of you is, how do we nurture the soil of consciousness that you're speaking about, this emergent consciousness that is going to be a mutational leap? How do we nurture that soil of consciousness now?
That's a great question.
Jeremy, you want to go for it first? You go.
All right. I think part of this maybe is as a practical response to what is felt as a life condition right now, an existential life condition. There's a lot of anxiety about what's breaking down. Our sense of time is breaking down. Our structure of everyday life is being rearranged very dramatically particularly during COVID, right, with the lockdown. And questions about supply chains and resources and whether or not we're really getting ready for this climate crisis if we can't handle this little virus in terms of collective response. So there's a lot of anxiety about what we can really rely on. And I think we have to trust that those things are breaking down right now. Those are invitations to let go, to compost our modes of thinking, our sense of time. There was an article in The Guardian complaining about how with no 9-to-5 job structure anymore, everyone's just at home. There's no sense of weekday or weekend. And they said time has become a time soup. Time is melting down, and it was a sense of vertigo that a lot of people are experiencing. And it was just complaining about this now. I think this is a wonderful opportunity to explore what is being composted, what is actually being overturned and flipped over and no longer has primacy anymore, just existentially, right? Our sense of time is being restructured, allowing that to happen, right? And for folks who are more on the ecological side of things, like Jem Bendell and Joe Brewer, who are just doing some great work studying climate change and bioregionalism and how to respond. Jem Bendell particularly is talking about collapse not as a possibility, but as a reality that we are undergoing. And I don't think that's necessarily as catastrophic as it sounds. Our modes of being in the world are breaking down. They are going through a kind of a death process or a composting process. So the more readily we can accept that and work with it, the less suffering, the less struggle has to happen, right? So how do we get our hands in the compost? How do we help this along? Because then we can start growing things that actually nurture us rather than just give us vertigo or make us unprepared for a future that will, out of necessity, be more ecological, like in Barbara's book title, like terrestrial. Bruno Latour talks about this sort of new orientation that we're all undergoing right now, this restructuration of the world, moving back towards the terrestrial, coming down to earth. It's the name of one of his books that I've been telling everybody to go read during the pandemic. So how do we become terrestrial? And maybe this is a segue for Barbara too. Like, how do we become terrestrial? How do we get down to earth? Because it seems like that is what everything is asking us to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah, same question for you, Barbara. How do we nurture the soil of consciousness, and how do we become terrestrial? That's beautiful.
Well, I think that, instead of focusing on germs, we can see right away that, this idea of germ came about mainly through Louis Pasteur. And at the time, there was a lot of, practices that we'll say weren't, sort of up to sanitary grade. And at the time, it was a term that got overused. And the idea of germ puts too much emphasis on an isolation of a particular microbe or virus, where if you understand how the fabric or the web of life operates, it operates as a symbiosis. That is, everything is making with everything else. Everything is a terrain. Nothing is separate. So this idea of germs was sort of a man-made name for singling out or vilifying microbes from making us sick. When, the other parts of the terrain, the raw sewage or the cows that were standing in their excrement weren't taken into consideration when they were describing germs. Whenever there is an imbalance in a terrain, certain viruses and microbes will get more virulent. And I tend to like the term virulent more so than germ, because germ means that something is attacking us, when really, viruses and microbes are just doing what they do, which is when they're under pressure, they will become more virulent. That is their genius. I mean, that is what has led to the diversification and the complexification of life. So I think understanding that everything comes down to a balance of the terrain, and whenever we get out of balance, there is going to be certain parts of the terrain that will become, sort of a bit of a problem. So, so I personally view everything now as terrain. I view my body as a terrain, an ecosystem that I can have agency with, so that I don't feel like I'm a victim, hiding in my home, afraid to go out because of germs. I try to sort of create as much diversity in my own terrain. I look at my body as an ecosystem. So diversifying my diet, I take probiotics, I take prebiotics, and I eat mushrooms. I forage as much of my food as I can. I grow a garden. I put my hands in the soil. I have plants in my home. I try to create a diverse terrain around me, both inside of me with everything I put in my body, knowing that my body is a garden. So I'm sort of How do I take care of my garden inside? And then how do I complexify my garden around me? So the world becomes very magical. The world becomes I become very intimate with my surroundings. I become intimate with what I put into my body, and I become intimate with what is around me. And I think we have to begin to see that we have this co-creative capacity with our lives and with the terrain around us that becomes quite magical in some ways. And, the natural world is extremely responsive. It responds. I mean, if you have a plant and you're, taking care of it, it responds as opposed to a plant that you ignore. So I think this falling in love with the natural world begins also with the body, and understanding that this body is really a miracle. Like, imagine all of those microbes that I'm hosting. Well, am I a good host or am I a bad host? It's like, or am I hosting nature in a sort of beautiful way, or am I being, tearing down everything around me to get a view? These are the things I think that we have to understand, is that we have so much agency. And I just think science is another language for magic. So when I say we have a new science, we're understanding that our world is very different than what we thought. When we actually begin to have an intimate interaction with the world, it becomes a very different place.
Beautiful. That might be another book title for you. My Body is a Garden. That's a very evocative phrase, and I would like to focus on a little bit on that right now, and the way that we're treating our own bodies, and the way that we're treating the soil seem to me to be very interconnected. And I'm very disturbed by the tremendous movement in the last 50 to 60 years, I guess, to move toward monocultural farming in the United States and really around the world. And it just seems to me that, I think it was Vandana Shiva who used the phrase monocultural thinking. It's almost it's a frame of mind too. I mean, it's an us against them frame of mind. It's the opposite of what we've been talking about here, where we're recognizing the world is interrelated. We're recognizing that our own body is interrelated. We are nurtured by these microbes. So if we're eating food that has been prepared in this monocultural way, where we're identifying pests as something to eradicate, or even worse, creating GMO foods which are pesticides, to make sure no pests come, we're not healthy. There's a lot of studies. I think, I'm sure you would agree, Barbara and Jeremy, about, eating certain kinds of food make your mood better, right? Because we're not healthy. We're not emotionally healthy either, So how can we, I sometimes think in terms of ceremonies. I mean, what's the ceremony we need to do now? All ceremony is ultimately about one level of reality being interconnected with other levels of reality. And all ceremonies are about bringing things into balance, resetting the balance. So what's the ceremony? What's the appropriate ceremony we need to do to rebalance with our microbial relatives now? That's what I want to ask you guys. Who would like to address it?
I don't know if I have a good answer for that, but it's a great question. Well, first of all, I think there are so many things we can be doing in community as a practice to reconnect with land, with bioregion, with cultivating a healthy relationship with that bioregion, and societal practices that you could see as a ritual, as a ceremony, right? I don't know if you read recently an article that I posted in the Mutations group by Douglas Rushkoff talking about big agriculture failing at making good food, and he says, I'll just read his line, the little tagline that I've been posting everywhere. "We know now beyond any doubt that industrial agriculture gets less food out of the ground with fewer nutrients, less efficiently, more expensively, and with greater environmental devastation than small and organic farming. This is no longer a debate." I mean, right there is an answer. What's not working? I mean, there's a mirror image of that, which is smaller organic farming that is bioregionally mindful. And we could see this as a ritual. I think, the divide between, as you know, in magical practice, to do the ritual is also intimately related with the material embodiment, right? So the aliveness of things. So having a different relationship with the land that we're on is a ritual. And to do that as a society is also a ritual. So that would be my take. We need a new relationship with where we are in a place-based sense, and it needs to become more place-based. If this means different forms of education, if this means, and I hate to privatize it, I hate to say it's up to us as individuals to do our little part, because even that is yes, that's important, but that's not where it stops. You know what I mean? Because it's been used as a way to isolate and alienate ourselves from each other. So how do we come together, in ritual to collectively practice a new way of being and relating to the world? That's my counter probe, right? As a question of inquiry of what do we do together to live more with sense of place, to live more with the aliveness of things instead of flattening it.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
Yes. Barbara?
Yeah, I agree with everything you're saying, Jeremy. And I think that, so for example, some of the things that I love to do, let's just take something like composting. I mean, when you actually do composting and you begin to see the breakdown of material, it's, maybe other people don't find this exciting, but I do. We could start with, everything is kind of hidden away. We put our garbage and it gets, it's like the rituals could be something simple like looking at nature and seeing how nature actually operates. And I remember the first time I saw horse manure and it was turned over and over. And then there was this heat coming off it. I couldn't believe it, that horse manure actually heats up and becomes this whole other thermodynamic substance just from turning it over and in the sun. So I think so much is hidden from us that we shield ourselves from, but we see it in the change of the seasons. We see it in the blossom that's happening right now in California. It's really incredible. So I think it's when we just go out with a curiosity about the natural world, it shines through. That's another word Gebser used, diaphany. There's a translucence, a diaphany that surrounds us, but most of the time we're not really slowed down enough to let it actually touch us. And the touching comes in the sense of my senses, my 5 senses as a human being. I can smell nature. I can see the blossoming. I can touch the diversity. I can smell the composting. And that smell of rain and the first rain and a smell of the wet earth, or, these are the things, and the hearing of the birds singing in the morning. I mean, rituals to me need to really start with the fact that I have this body, and this body allows me to interact with my 5 senses, with nature in a way that changes me as an individual. And, I see children and they're on these devices and they're not really interacting with the natural world. So we've become conditioned to actually feel separate from the natural world. So a lot of the remediation needs to be this re-engagement, re-enchantment, falling in love with the natural world. We've become so insulated. And, even with this COVID and social distancing, stay-at-home orders, quarantining, the very thing that we actually need to do in the middle of COVID, which is rewild ourselves, we're actually becoming more insular and removing ourselves from this, relationship with the natural world that our senses are built to engage in that way.
Okay, now I'm going to ask you guys something that honestly I don't know the answer. I have no idea, but how we can do this. So, but I want to. Hopefully, we can put our heads together and figure something out. Because what troubles me is the allure of progress. See, this is something I think Gebser does point at and undermine the simple thinking that has gone on. Because nowadays people think that if something was invented now or something proposed now or the news of the day, they always rate that as superior to what happened before. And obviously this is not exactly working, because we need to return to some perennial wisdom that's been there for antiquity with indigenous peoples, which has been it's kind of been repackaged under the name that came out of Australia, permaculture. But I mean, this is not something new, really. I mean, it's something that indigenous peoples understood for a long time how to work with, and you guys have been talking about it today. But what makes it so hard is that we are addicted to progress. So, Barbara, you're talking about, people are on their devices and they can't connect with nature. Well, there's weird little apps where people can point their phones at flowers or something, and it'll tell you what kind of flower that is or what kind of plant it is. But there's something cold about that, it's a naming. It's just a nouning, so that once we've nouned it, once we've named it, it's over. We understand it, but we don't really understand it because we're not participating in it, like Jeremy was talking about. So how can we get people to be truly open to all the wisdom that's been around for a long time, and without nixing what's been going on, but open to another way of doing it? How do we get people to do small farming or just farms that are truly interactive, that are making use of the animals and thinking about the whole farm as an ecosystem, instead of just growing corn, soybeans, rice. The U.S. government keeps giving out incentives for farmers to just grow these single crops. How can we shift this? How can we shift this in a deep way that it actually takes root?
Excellent question. That is the priceless question that so many different communities are experimenting with and asking right now. I would mention the localization movements that we see happening not only all over the United States, but really all over the world, where there's a small farm movement. There is, I think Jason Snyder is one of the popularizers of this in my immediate community online. We're talking about homesteading and bioregionalism. But not everybody can go ahead and buy some land and start a homestead. It's a difficult process, and it's not necessarily an answer for everybody's way of life. But I do think there are ways, like, for instance, I'll bring up Jeff Vandermeer's great little set of tips or suggestions for rewilding your backyard in the suburbs. And it's really simple. Like he suggests, like, get a bird bath, spend a lot of time just watching your environment and seeing what's there, and then growing local flora and allowing creatures to return. And then and really with so-called permaculture, or what was it called? Permaculture gardening. It's really a sense of just planting some things and making space for nature to take refuge in your yard. That's it. I mean, it's really not a hands-on process of pruning and mowing the lawn and doing all the kind of landscaping. It's letting go and having the right application of activity, just enough, right? So there's so many little practices we can do to shift, I think, our relationship with the non-human world, even in a place that is deeply suburban and not necessarily in some remote, wild and beautiful place. Maybe even in a city. I don't know what rewilding in a city looks like, but there's certainly movements like that. So that's one attempt. I think that's many different attempts. And then there's also the smart village movement that I've been following recently, and that's very interesting as kind of an extension of the homesteading and relocalization movement. But they're playing around with very similar principles of how do we apply the principles of permaculture to a small community that's still very much plugged into the world. So I think this regenerative turn, right? A lot of them call themselves regenerative culture practices, regenerative communities, are very important and part of the answer to that question. Although I don't think it may be the penultimate answer in the sense that there's still so much more learning to do and work to be done. Like adjacent to that is, I mentioned earlier, Joe Brewer's work and what he's doing with working with regenerating a particular area of land that he's recently purchased, but he also wants to turn it into an educational space, a bioregional learning center that other people can kind of take up and practice in their own particular regions that may need some remediation. So, as things get more difficult in this century, we're really going to be needing people who are pioneering this in the sense of really experimenting with bioregional learning and sharing their notes and preparing for a new way of relating to a sense of place. That's my immediate answer here, but I don't feel it's sufficient. And maybe that's good. We're in a place where none of the answers are sufficient.
Yeah.
Well, that's good. That's a good start. I appreciate the answer. Barbara?
Yeah, I mean, I have started to do some fermenting of vegetables because fermented foods are rich in microbes and they occur naturally. So instead of buying a probiotic at a natural food store, I can start to, and it's amazing. It's just like taking cabbage and putting it in water and leaving it for a couple of days. And you come back and you look at your jar and this cabbage is beginning to break down and it forms an elixir that's kind of acidic but smells really good. And then I use the elixir in my salad dressing. So like I'm getting creative with food and what I can do with food and realize that nature does fermenting and kombucha, that's a natural expression of what nature does. You take anything alive and leave it out for a few days, there's going to be microbes on it. And so you can have these experiments going on all around you on a countertop, a jar of cabbage and watching it decompose, I often think of children and like just even when I was a child, just taking these, agar dishes, petri dishes and leaving it out overnight and watching all the microbes grow on it and coming back in the morning and seeing mold. It's realizing that everything is alive and that, nature just is teeming with life. And, if you begin to see food as that, teeming with life and be curious about different kinds of food. I've been experimenting with mushrooms and I love mushrooms and they're very powerful and what else? I guess, greens, and understanding that greens can go into all of my dishes, juicing greens, juicing vegetables. Just there's so many ways to prepare food that, involves just this wonderful way that nature is just generative, and food becomes something other than just I have to eat. It becomes like, wow, what can I put in my body today that feels alive and is teeming with life? Even just colors. I go into the grocery store, I pick like the red peppers, the yellow peppers, the orange cauliflower, the eggplants, being drawn to these colors of nature that we know
Beautiful.
are rich in phytonutrients. And so even the way I shop for groceries becomes different. Nature is so incredibly teeming with color, life, vibrancy. And
so we should eat like a painter.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
And Barbara, so when I have something in my refrigerator, right, and it's like yogurt, for instance, and I've left it there, I would say too long, and something starts growing in it, is that still safe to eat? I mean, do you know about these things? I mean, yogurt itself is already, it's like we throw that out, but maybe we're doing the wrong thing. I don't know.
Well, yeah, I mean, I can't advocate for, eating things beyond shelf life, but I think that just understanding that nature is teeming with life, microbial life, and we're eating this all the time, and we are a garden. I mean, I don't know what else to say, just other than it's like you coming and asking yourself, how are you treating your garden? I think it's interesting that, vitamin D became one of the treatments for COVID, preventative treatments for COVID. Vitamin D comes from the sun. We had become so deficient in vitamin D because of using, sunblock, even children lathering sunblock on. Vitamin D was one of the first condoned treatments for COVID and prevention of COVID. Vitamin D comes from the sun. So we were even deficient in vitamin C. So I think nature is a healer, and I think it's like seeing nature more than the backdrop for our lives. But as we live in this alive world that is, healing, food is healing, plants are healing, mushrooms are healing.
Bacteria and viruses are almost always healing, and yet we're right, and we're focusing on the cases where they become virulent and aren't, and because that's frightening to people. Yeah, but I have one more kind of question for you guys, because wow, I love what you're saying. It's really great. It truly is a regenerative conversation. We said in the beginning that we're going to be talking about time-free consciousness. So, I really meant that in every sense of the word, not just to pull on perennial wisdom, which is the most obvious solution for a lot of our problems, but also if we're really talking about time-free consciousness, we're also inviting the future to guide us. We're inviting the future, as Gebser would say, the future to become immanent in us. Mm-hmm. So so I truly believe that there is a consciousness shift happening where people are going to realize how we're interconnected with nature again. because we used to understand this very well, and it's still very well understood in the indigenous world and amongst certain people outside of those communities. But for many of us, we're not. So how are we going to manifest that future where we understand that everything is interconnected? How are we going to make that imminent in us? How are we going to invite it? How are we going to pull it in?
Ooh, okay. So part of this, I think, is what I'm exploring in my next book. Really, it's how to reclaim time, how to reclaim a living relationship with time and becoming present. And I'm actually thinking of a German philosopher, Byung-Chul Han, who writes about this in his book is called The Scent of Time. It's this wonderful little philosophical text about reclaiming time right towards the end of the text. And he says, mindless overexertion of activity kills time, and we even use that as a phrase. I need to just kill time, right? We fill time up, we use it, but we don't fulfill time, as Gebser says, right? So Byung-Chul Han is talking about this new relationship with time, or reclaiming a contemplative form of time, to linger, right? To not rush forward. You were just mentioning that this is not a time freedom, right? And Gebser points this out in Ever-Present Origin back in the 40s and probably earlier. This sense of rushing ahead that is so concordant with modernity is not, in truth, a form of time freedom, or a freedom of or some kind of transcended capacity. We are out of control with that form of time, right? With clock time, with machination, with motoricity. The machine world is a sort of intensity, a kind of occluded expression of integrality that the spatial world is attempting to master, right? But it has such intensity that it keeps bursting apart the spatial world, so much so that time feels like it's destroying us. I have no more time. So Byung-Chul Han talks about this capacity to move into, have time for lingering and reversals and becoming present as a way to reclaim time, and not to kill it, but to liberate it. And as he says, the democratization of labor has to happen alongside the democratization of time. And I thought that was wonderful. I thought if Gebser had read that, he would have put that in EPO of, who are the philosophers talking about this. So this democratization of time, this capacity to linger, and we've been mentioning that too in terms of paying attention and being in the natural world. There's different rhythms of time that are all coexistent with us if we are able to pay attention and readjust. And maybe COVID was a good opportunity for some of us to do that, being stuck at home and having that time soup happen, time melting down. The rushing forward was paused and halted and even reversed. So a new relationship with time and becoming present, I think, is the beginning of this capacity to have time freedom. But what Gebser mentions is it's freedom for all times, right? This integral consciousness, like motoricity, slowing down, contemplative time, time as labor, time as leisure, time as cycles and seasons, time as timelessness. These are all alive things in us that cannot be flattened. And so we're finding ways to cultivate that and concretize that in ourselves in day-to-day life opens us up, allows us to be the multi-dimensional beings that we actually are. And he says, if you live that way intensely enough, then the falseness of time that our modern world is so locked into, not that it'll magically disappear, but that you will not be able to engage with it in the same way. And then if enough of us have that intensity, that perhaps we can begin to produce the new and create the new and make that leap as a culture, right? Because there's that important thing that observation Gebser always makes about these mutations of consciousness are not, yes, they are individual. Yes, they have a relationship with our own volition and courage to take that leap, but also it's happening of itself, right? This is something that the world is almost initiating us into. And so we're being challenged, I think, as a culture to engage time differently, right? To not be speeding ahead and not have this sort of very unhealthy relationship with the non-human world, which has to do with this false sense of time. that we're alluding to. So that's my brief attempt.
I love it.
I
love it. And we can take it to Congress too. They're always saying, reclaiming my time. At those. But if you can speak to them about how the deeper meaning of reclaiming my time, we might get somewhere. Barbara, so how are we going to manifest the future that is imminent in us? And I want you to maybe call upon your microbial ancestral allies, and the future microbes also, to how they can help us manifest this good future.
Well, first of all, I would just like to say that all of these species of microbes and viruses are a consciousness. In other words, they are doing what they're doing. We're just the host. They are doing they are these microbes and viruses living within us. And then there's a genetic pool of material that they create. So in other words, the individual constituents are there, but the pool of information that they create just by their existence. I mean, that's the most amazing thing about microbes. They are holobionts. They are architectural formations. They are assemblages that are organized around mutual support and cooperation. So the whole field is in communication and sharing information and sharing nucleotides and sharing genes and genetic material constantly. It's like a hum that's happening all the time. And that is what our human physiology is embedded in. So I begin to think about my body this way now. And I often will sit in my meditation and feel the humming in my system, the vibration. I mean, we know they have a communication that's called sensum quaring, which means it's a vibrancy. So I actually tune into that now in my meditation. And I tune into it with this understanding that Gebser teaches us, that everything that's ever been, the whole origin is in that teeming life inside of me. It's not just what I ate yesterday or it is the ever-present origin that has survived 5 extinctions. And here we are now, some we're on the brink of the 6th mass extinction. I'm going to put my trust in these microbes, because if I don't, what else can I put it in? I mean, seriously, what else can I put it in?
That is, God, so beautiful. Thank you. I'm almost tearing up because.
Well, this is how
I can feel it.
How I tune in. So people say to me, Barbara, why are you so involved with microbes, and why are you? It's like I never went after this, you guys. I just became curious, and then I started to have a relationship with my body. And fell in love with this intelligence that is me. I'm not separate from it. They're not separate from us. We are our microbes. I've said this before. We are our viruses. We are them. So it's a matter of recognizing that these are not germs to be killed, but that this is a consciousness that is primordial. And it's the fabric of all existence. And if we vilify this consciousness, which is at the very basis of life, then we are really doomed. We can have technology, but these microbes are the very thread of everything we see around us.
I love what you're saying, and I'm deeply moved. We had on the very first Circle for Original Thinking podcast. We had on a Colombian Mama Duico, calling in from the high Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta mountains, and for them, what you're speaking about is deeply important. And it's establishing a communication with the elementals, they would call them,
exactly right.
So because we're establishing a communication with the invisible world, because without microscopic technology, we can't see these microbes and viruses, but they're there, they're exerting a very important presence. And it's one that we do need to come into balance. And it's my prayer. I personally pray a lot to viruses, to bacteria, to microbes, to germs, because I see germs germinate. Germs germinate. That's all the basis of life. So my prayer is that we truly come back into beautiful relationship with the living soil, and that permeates our gut. And makes us happy, gives us a gut feeling, a gut instinct that then flowers into rational thought that is truly interconnected with our gut, that makes us whole, that feels whole, and we feel interconnected with the natural world. Oh, that's what I want to see happen, and I know it's possible. And people like you, Jeremy, you, Barbara, you are doing something great in the world, and I really appreciate your presence and your presence today. Thank you so much. I know we can do this, humanity, but we need to let go. We need to let go and allow the beautiful intelligence of nature to flower within us, not try to control it. So thank you so much for a fantastic conversation. This program is made possible in part by Select Books, Waterside Publications, BizGenix, and Web Talk Radio. Native flute music by Orlando Secatero from the Pathways CD. Liberty Song by artist Ron Crowder, written by Ron Crowder, Jim Casey, and Danny Casey. Post-production editing by Scout Media Strategies. The Circle for Original Thinking is a grassroots think tank whose mission is to seek out the deep origins of contemporary thought in order to remember and restore heart-centered wisdom for humanity and all our relations on Earth. For more information or to volunteer to help produce this podcast, go to originalthinking.us or originalpolitics.us. And you can also find and purchase my books, Original Thinking and Original Politics, there. Thank you. Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, Barbara. Thank you so much for listening. And until next week, many blessings of good health and well-being to you in your guts. Thank you. We spilled our guts here, but it's what was so beautiful. Thank you.